Hello and welcome everybody, my name is Poison Ducky and welcome to this new series, What a Faction Do. A lot of my friends have been getting into Total War Warhammer lately. It's been pretty new due to the Steam sales, making Warhammer 1, 2, and the following DLCs quite affordable. Let's just say that for sure. And I get a lot of questions like, what faction should I play? What does the faction do? And why should I play the faction comparatively to other ones? Now, my first opinion on that matter is definitely that you should play the faction. I think that looks cool and really speaks to you on like a style format, regardless of difficulty, because it doesn't take too long to understand how a faction works. Although some factions are definitely better than others, and that's what this video is for. It's more educational, and we're going to definitely work on what faction you should try to attempt to be playing and why you should play it. So let's get on to our first faction. Getting into our first faction, we have the Brut Onehans, which is the cavalry-focused faction of man. This is a French medieval kind of aesthetic, meaning they have the peasant and knight kind of style of old, and that means they have cavalry for every single situation. This is what the real powerhouse of Bretonia. They have really powerful light cavalry, which the yeomen, they can chase off dogs, get into the back line of archers. They have the most effective medium costing cavalry with something like Knights of the Realm, and of course they have the all-powerful heavy cav, which is going to be the Grail Guardians and the Grail Knights. Another powerful part of Bretonia is their flying cavalry. A lot of people usually forget about this, but they have things like Royal Pegasus Knights and just normal Pegasus Knights. Extremely powerful, can throw a curveball for your opponent when they're not expecting a flying force that they have to deal with. Now, a little bit on the weaker side of things, they have low leadership for their infantry. They are essentially run by peasants, and peasants aren't good, with being a little bit better being their men-at-arms, and with one exception to the rule, they do have battle pilgrims and foot squires, which is okay. I would say they're medium infantry at best, and that's kind of saying something if the Bretonian infantry is at best like medium quality. Now, their ranged options are a little mediocre. They only have peasant bowman with a few different arrow types for different situations, which can be really nice, but at least they have range options that are decent comparatively to other factions, and it's cheap, which is really great. Now, of course, they have access to the superior siege weapon, which is the trebuchet. Of course, much better than the catapult, r/trebuchet. And they have great leadership options, which is the King Luan Lianke, and they have Albert de Bordelot, and of course, last but not least, the Lady. All giving access to extremely powerful. I would say King Luan Lianke is the best leader with his amazing ability to debuff enemy blobs, and he has regeneration. Next would probably be the Lady because of the Lore of Life. And lastly, they do have access to the Lore of Life, which will be able to heal your units. Very important, because if you heal your cavalry, you accrue so much value as you hammer and anvil, you charge them, you cycle charge with all your lances. Extremely powerful faction. It's a little bit harder for newer players, because you have to control lots of cavalry and fleeing peasants. Of course, peasants will flee. So if it looks cool, go ahead and play it. But I'm just going to say it's a little bit tougher, but once you master this faction, you will have a blast destroying people with peasants and knights. Next in our lineup are the Proud Dahui. These are the dwarves, and this is a defensive faction. One of the best things about them is that almost everything in their roster is armored. You're going to need a lot of armor-piercing damage to get through these Dahui, and it really shows, as there's just a few exceptions in terms of their armored rule, but everything can be upwards up to 120 armor. Now, they counteract this with low mobility. Dwarves are known for being very dangerous over short distances, and it shows, as they have great projectiles. To try to counteract their low mobility, they have things like Thunderers, Quarrelers, great and powerful artillery that can make sure that you have to go to the dwarves and the dwarves don't have to go you, which really plays in the defensive faction playstyle. Now, one of their biggest weaknesses is they have almost no large units. Something like they have no sort of rat ogre, no cavalry, no large unit that can keep other large units in place, but that kind of leads into their use of magic. They don't have a useful lore, and they don't actually use the winds of magic, and very few factions will actually be able to do this. In fact, the dwarves are the only one that don't use the winds of magic, but they use runes instead. So these are very powerful support abilities, things that allow for slowing down enemies, increasing armor of everyone in a vicinity, and making units immune to psychology, which is like fear and terror. So they are looking to grind down the enemy over long periods of time. They have a lot of defensive power, but their offensive power is a little bit lacking. In terms of their leadership, they have extremely powerful leadership, but everything with the exception of the anvil lords on an anvil, their leadership is all foot lords, which can be run down, but when they get into sustained combat, they can truly destroy anything they fight. Thinking of Grombrindle or Ungrim Iron Fist, all those things like that. Now, the weaknesses to the dwarves is that their potentials is that they can get quick alpha strikes, can really destroy them. Throw monsters at them that can come out dragons, crypt horrors, chariots. Anything that can run over a dwarf is extremely dangerous, as they can make it into the back line rather quickly. But if you master the dwarf defensive playstyle, make sure you defend your back line, allow them to destroy, shoot at all the targets that are expensive and needed to be destroyed, you can have a lot of fun playing the dwarf faction. Rounding out the factions of man, we have the Empire, which I consider to be a balanced faction with a wide range of infantry, but with low leadership. Powerful cavalry choices, looking at the demigryph with halberds specifically, and of course they have Empire Knights, Knights of the Blazing Sun, and a lot of skirmish cavalry with outriders and pistoliers. Support skills through the use of their faith to Sigmar, specifically the warrior priest, and great range options, looking at their handgunners, their huntsmen, their archers, and their crossbows. This looking at overall, they have pretty much tools for any situation and any matchup. They have interesting artillery pieces, with crate cannons being fantastic, but they always have the Sunmaker and a bunch of essentially firework makers to hit your opponent's light armored infantry, and their leadership is fantastic, with mostly looking at Karl Franz being one of the best gooning lords in the game, and having anti-large specialists that essentially take out any caster or even enemy lords in one-on-one combat, except it's like Kolek. Of course, the Empire has access to the mighty steam tank war machine. It is the best. Obviously, the steam tank needs to be in every faction, and it should be priced at about 200 gold because it's obviously way too powerful. You need to buff it some more. And they have access to the Luminarch, which is essentially just a Mac Blast on a little cart. Their wide selection of lores of magic, they have access to almost every basic lore of magic. Nothing unique like Lore of the Deep or Lore of Nekahara. That makes even them, literally, Empire is the jack of all, master of none faction. They don't have the best of anything, but they have access to tools that essentially you can work on the weaknesses of enemy factions. Although, in terms of the infantry, it's a little bit worse. They only have access to state troops, which is like swordsmen, some spearmen, and halberds. So if you want to exploit the Empire, the one weakness is their infantry, so always be looking at that. And overall, they do have some expensive choices when it comes to cavalry. They have their medium cavalry is not fantastic. They would definitely lose against Bretonnian cav, so be careful out there when fighting this. But if you want to be the guy that can master a faction that is the jack of all trades, you can really use all your tools and force your opponent to work with their weaknesses if you're playing as the Empire. A really great faction overall, just a little harder to get the reins on. Heading on over to the Elven factions, we have the High Elves, which I would say is another balanced faction with an emphasis on archers, dragons, and very powerful magic abilities. They have one of the best ranged units in the game with the Sisters of Avalorn. Armor-piercing archers with magic damage is nothing to scoff at, and they have the access to the most powerful dragon in the game, which is the Star Dragon. They have fantastic cavalry, which is a heavy cav, and they have light cav. They kind of don't have a medium cav. They do have the Silver Helms, which is not a fantastic one, but fantastic heavy cav and light cav with Dragon Princes and Illyrian Reavers. But they have a problem with what most elf factions generally have, and that is their high cost and low numbers. Very powerful infantry, very powerful cavalry and archers. They tend to be a little specialized, though, in terms of cost. They have, usually their baseline is spearmen, but they have access to units such as the Sword Masters of Hoth, which is an anti-infantry greatsword unit, and the Phoenix Guard, which is your halberd unit. That is, but even though they're halberds, they can deal with almost everything, but they're expensive. So elves tend to be easily overwhelmed, and they have a lack of artillery. They only have the Eagle Claw bolt thrower, but they make it up with their extremely powerful archers. Powerful healing magic with their lore choices. I think the best one is definitely Alariel the Radiant, having access to the Star of Avalorn and the Lore of Life spells. She has a mixed kind of lore, but she has one of the best spell choices in the game, keeping your dragons, keeping your dragon princes, cavalry, up to par and having almost full health for most of the game. So do they have tools for almost every situation? Yes. They're only lacking in artillery. You generally have to approach them, but their prices tend to be a little bit high. So fielding a large high elf army is going to be uncommon for sure, but you can definitely still do it, and they are extremely cost effective. So if you want to play a faction that has a very powerful roster of units that can deal with most situations, play as the High Elves because they've got the healing and the arrows. Our second entry into the Elves is going to be the Wood Elves, and if I had to classify this faction into like a class, I would give this a Strike Force faction. They have an emphasis on elite, low armor units and archers that can fire on the move. They have high killing power cavalry with the Wild Riders and access to Forest Dragons and Treekins as their large units. They can play as either a rush faction, if you go with like a Treekin, Azerite Spear, high powerful, like really elite killing power rush. They can really deal it, or they can do an archer-centric kiting faction with their Way Watchers. I'll admit, it's one of my most hated factions to go against, but it is effective. And that's why I really dislike it. It's not very fun for me to go against, but truth be told, it's effective, and it is a high-skill faction. They have low numbers, they can be overwhelmed, and low armor, so you really don't need armor piercing to deal with the Wood Elves, with the exception of their tree spirits. And their lord choices are a little bit limited. You generally do not pick their legendary lords, actually. You usually pick their generic Glade Lord or Glade Lady lords, which is interesting, but they do have access to the Lore of Life. As most good guy factions, they can heal their units and keep them topped up for what seems to be an eternity when you fight them. So if you want to play a faction that's actually it has very different polarizing playstyles depending on the units that you choose, but extremely high skill cap. I would say Wood Elves have one of the highest skill cap factions in the game, with their low armor, high speed, very powerful units. Definitely give them a try. For a newer player, I do not recommend this, but if you get this faction down to a T, you will be one of the best players in the game, and it really shows in tournament play. The last of the Elven factions are going to be the Dark Elves, or as I call them, the Edgy Elves. This is going to be a balanced faction, but like the High Elves and the Wood Elves, it's going to be like a balanced elite faction. They have access to armor-piercing projectiles with their Dark Shards and Shades. You shoot these like special crossbows that can hurt anything, and they're super powerful. They have access to some of the strongest monsters in the game with the Black Dragon, Hydras, Manticores, Harpies. You can name Medusa. It's a very powerful monster roster, along with a very powerful elite infantry roster with the Harganeth Executioners and the Black Guard of Nagaron. So, I've named good infantry, good monsters, and good archer/crossbow play. What else could they have? Really powerful cavalry play. They have access to the units that are Slanesh's Harvesters, which are very light armor, high speed, high killing power kind of unit, and Cold One Dread Knights, which are essentially just Dark Elves riding Velociraptors with armor-piercing anti-large abilities. Dark Elves have pretty much everything, including generals. If you look at their leadership choices, you have Malekith. Malekith is the probably top 3 legendary lords in the game with access to riding a Black Dragon. He has Lore of Dark, which is a unique lore only the Dark Elves get, and he is a fantastic melee specialist. He can kill essentially anything in combat, especially when combined with his spells. With Malekith boosting up the Dark Elves in terms of tier lists and just power level, you'll find the Dark Elves have very few weaknesses. In fact, I believe Dark Elves to be a top tier faction, and if you want to play a faction that is one of the best in the game, I think you should pick the Dark Elves. But every faction does have its weaknesses, and the Dark Elves do have, albeit a few of them, they still have some of them. If you're looking at artillery power, Dark Elves have almost none. They have the Reaper Bolt Claw Throwers, which is essentially a glorified ballista, and it doesn't really help them. You can't deal with cannons, really can't deal with mortar pieces or other very powerful artillery pieces, so you'll find that the Dark Elves have to approach the enemy more so than the enemy approaching the Dark Elves. But with the high killing power of the Dark Elves and their murderous prowess allowing them to become more powerful as you kill more units, Dark Elves are a top tier faction, and if you want to play one, they might take a little bit of time to learn, but if you really master this, you can go into tournaments and you will beat very competitive players with this faction. Lastly, but most definitely not least, it's going to be the Lizardmen for this part 1 of our faction overviews. This is the Monster Mash faction. Think Jurassic Park. They have amazing leadership and powerful dinosaurs with a decent infantry roster with high holding power. They have good cavalry with the Cold One riders and some Horned One action, but you really don't see it too often because it's the dinosaurs that outshine everything. They have units such as Carnosaurs, Stegodons, they have Bastiladons, they have flying units such as Pterodons and the Ripperdactyls. So far we've seen a lot of monster power right here, but the weaknesses you'll find is that they have limited ranged options with only blow darts and javelins and one little Bastiladon with like a laser cannon. They have access to very powerful lores of magic, and what's really special about the Lizardmen is that their leadership has these Slann mages, which essentially means they have more winds of magic than almost every other faction, with access to some powerful spells like Banishment and power like shields that have damage wards. This is a tanky faction. You want them, not only do they have armor, they have high sustain, they have power to boot. The only thing holding them back is their ranged capabilities. They will grind you to a pulp if you do not have the access to destroy their units. Now, weaknesses looking at the Lizardmen is that if you want to beat them, you want to use projectiles such as crossbows or archers, really shoot at those dinosaurs because it's kind of hard to miss them. And other usually anti-large units, something like halberds, chosen with halberds, just halberdiers, anything that has a strong anti-large bonus will deal really well in the matchup against Lizardmen. But I think Lizardmen overall are probably one of the easiest factions to play, as it usually forces your opponent to kind of play your game instead of you have to playing their game, if you understand what I mean. So if you're a new player and you want a faction that's rather easy to pick up, yet very competitive and very fun to play, choose the Lizardmen, because you know what's scarier than a T-Rex charging in your front lines? Not much. So play the Lizardmen, throw a T-Rex at your opponents. And that's going to be all for the first part of this unit series. I'm going to definitely have a second part with the more bestial, more barbaric factions, but I hope you really liked the video. I had fun making it, and thankfully I can finally send this video off to friends that are wondering, like, man, what faction I want to play. So leave a like if you liked it, and subscribe if you guys want more. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll catch you guys later.